The autumn mist clung to the Elburz Mountains like a shroud. It was November 1256, and atop a jagged peak, rising more than 2,000 meters above the valleys of northern Persia, the fortress of Alamut stood in its final days. For 166 years, this place had been untouchable. Kings had sent armies. Sultans had laid sieges. All had failed. The mountain itself seemed to guard the fortress, its cliffs dropping away into nothingness, its single winding approach easily defended by a handful of determined men. But the army now surrounding Alamut was not like the others. From his vantage point on the battlements, Ruk al-Din Kursha could see them spreading across the valley floor like a dark tide. Mongol warriors, tens of thousands of them, their horses grazing in organized lines that stretched to the horizon. Among them moved something far more terrifying than cavalry: siege engines. Massive wooden structures towered above the camps, their counterweights already being tested, their throwing arms groaning under the strain of practice shots. Chinese engineers moved between them, calculating angles, measuring distances, speaking in languages the defenders did not understand. Rukn al-Din was 27 years old. He had inherited the leadership of the Nizari Ismaili state less than 2 years earlier, following his father's assassination. He was educated, pious, and completely unprepared for this moment. The strategy that had protected his people for generations, the art of the hidden blade, the carefully planned assassination that could topple kingdoms without armies, was useless now. The Mongols did not care if you killed one general. They had 1,000 more. They did not fear death. They worshipped it. Below, a trebuchet released its load. The stone arced through the cold air, a dark shape against the gray sky, and struck the lower wall with a sound like thunder. Dust and fragments exploded outward. The defenders scrambled away from the impact point. Another stone followed, then another. The siege engines were finding their range. This was not a battle. It was an execution. And the question facing every soul trapped on that mountain was not whether Alamut would fall, but whether anything of them would survive when it did. To understand how the world's most feared assassins found themselves cornered on a mountaintop, one must understand the collision of two empires, two philosophies, two utterly incompatible visions of power. The Nizari Ismailis had never been a conventional state. They possessed no great cities, no sprawling farmlands, no trade routes of their own. What they controlled was a network of mountain fortresses scattered across Persia and Syria, each one a node in a web of covert influence that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. Their weapon was not the army but the assassin, the fidai, who could infiltrate any court, any fortress, any army, and strike at the head rather than the body. Hassan-i Sabbah, the founder of their order, had captured Alamut in 1090 without shedding a drop of blood. He had sent missionaries into the valley, converted the local population, and when the time came, his supporters inside the fortress simply opened the gates. It was a masterpiece of subversion. For the next century and a half, the Nizaris refined this approach. They killed Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier who ruled the Seljuk Empire. They struck down al-Afdal in the heart of Cairo. They sent crusader kings fleeing behind layers of bodyguards. Saladin himself, the great unifier of Islam, survived 2 assassination attempts, and afterwards negotiated peace rather than face a third. The Nizaris did not need to conquer territory. They needed only to make their enemies afraid. But fear only works when your opponent values individual life, when survival depends on specific leaders, when the cost of replacing the dead is higher than the cost of accommodation. The Mongols valued none of these things. By 1251, when Mongol Khan ascended as Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, his domain stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, built not through diplomacy or assassination, but through total war. The Mongols moved as a nation in arms, their entire society organized for conquest. They practiced a military system so efficient, so brutally effective, that it would not be matched until the mechanized armies of the 20th century. Mongol's orders to his brother Hulagu were explicit: march west, subjugate Persia, eliminate the Nizari fortresses, force the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to submit or destroy him, advance to Egypt if possible. The Mongols did not negotiate. They did not recognize sovereignty. There was only submission or annihilation. For the Nizaris, who had built their entire existence on the principle that a small, intelligent force could outmaneuver a larger, conventional one. The approaching Mongol army represented an existential paradox. How do you assassinate your way out of total war? How do you intimidate an enemy that has already decided you must cease to exist? The answer, it turned out, was that you could not. Hulagu Khan began his westward march in 1253. It took him 2 years to reach Persia, not from caution, but from logistics. He was moving what amounted to an entire civilization across the roof of Asia. By Munkay's command, 2 out of every 10 soldiers in the entire Mongol Empire were assigned this campaign. Historians estimate the force at somewhere between 120,000 and 200,000 men, though precise numbers remain debated. What is certain is that nothing on the scale had been seen in Persia for centuries. But numbers were not Hulagu's greatest advantage. Organization was. The Mongol army that entered Persia in late 1255 brought with it Chinese and Persian engineers who had spent decades perfecting siege warfare. They brought mangonels and ballistae. They brought counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing 300 pounds over distances of 300 meters. They brought naphtha throwers and primitive incendiary devices. Most importantly, they brought the logistical apparatus to sustain these weapons in terrain where conventional armies starved. Hulagu's strategy was methodical. He did not rush toward Alamut. Instead, he established a forward base at Qazvin and began gathering intelligence. Spies were sent into the Nizari territories disguised as merchants, pilgrims, travelers. They mapped approaches to fortresses. They identified water sources. They cataloged the loyalty or resentment of local populations. The Mongols understood that mountain fortresses could not be starved if the valleys below supported them, so the valleys would have to be cleared first. At Alamut, Rukn al-Din attempted to respond. He sent envoys to Hulagu offering tribute, submission, anything short of total surrender. The envoys returned with a simple message: evacuate the fortresses, dismantle the walls, present yourself in person. There would be no negotiation. The Nizaris could surrender unconditionally, or they could die. Rukn al-Din faced a crumbling coalition. Several fortress commanders questioned his authority. Some argued for resistance to the death. Others advocated immediate submission. The treasury was depleted from years of internal conflict and external pressure. The network of alliances that had once allowed the Nizaris to play greater powers against each other had collapsed. The Seljuks were broken. The Abbasid Caliphate was weak. The Crusader states were dying. There was no one left to manipulate, no balance of power to exploit. In the Kohistan region to the east, the Mongols began their campaign in earnest. One by one, the outlying fortresses fell. Some surrendered immediately, hoping for mercy. They received none. The garrisons were executed, the populations enslaved or massacred, the walls dismantled stone by stone. This was not conquest for territory. It was eradication. The Mongols intended to ensure that the Nizari state could never rise again. By the autumn of 1256, Hulagu's army had moved north into the Rudbar Valley, the heartland of Nizari power. Alamut, perched on its mountain peak, watched them come. The first fortress to face the full weight of Mongol siege technology was not Alamut, but Maymun-Diz, a stronghold built on a rocky outcrop several days' march to the south. It was smaller than Alamut, but still formidable. Its walls rising from cliffs, its garrison experienced, its supplies stockpiled for a long siege. The defenders had every reason to believe they could hold out for months, perhaps long enough for the winter snows to force the Mongols to withdraw. The siege began on a cold November morning in 1256. Mongol engineers surveyed the fortress from multiple angles, taking measurements, consulting with each other in low voices. By afternoon, they had positioned their trebuchets on the high ground surrounding the fortress. These were not the simple traction trebuchets common in the Islamic world, pulled by teams of men. These were counterweight machines, using the force of gravity to hurl projectiles with devastating accuracy. The bombardment started at dawn the following day. Stone after stone crashed into Maymun-Diz's walls. The defenders shot back with arrows and dropped rocks on anyone who approached too close, but the siege engines were positioned beyond effective range of hand weapons. All the garrison could do was watch as their defenses were methodically dismantled. Not in weeks, not in days, in hours. On the third day, a section of the outer wall collapsed. Mongol assault troops, heavily armored and carrying scaling ladders, moved forward under covering fire from archers. The defenders fought desperately, pouring boiling oil, throwing stones, engaging in hand-to-hand combat at the breaches. For a moment it seemed they might hold. Then a second wall section gave way, then a third. The fortress was not falling gradually. It was being pulverized. On the 11th day of the siege, the commander of Maymun-Diz requested terms. There were none. Hulagu ordered the garrison executed to the last man. The fortress was stripped of anything valuable, then systematically destroyed. Local laborers were forced to dismantle what the siege engines had not already ruined. When the Mongols moved on, Maymun-Diz was rubble. The message was clear. Mountain fortresses were not safe. Height was not protection. The age of the impregnable castle was over. News of Maymun-Diz's fall reached Alamut within days. Panic rippled through the garrison. These men had spent their lives believing that their fortresses were untouchable, that mountain warfare favored the defender, that patience and supply stockpiles could outlast any siege. Maymun-Diz had proven all of that wrong. If a fortress could fall in 11 days, how long could any of them hold? Rukn al-Din convened his advisors. The debate was bitter. Some commanders advocated fighting to the end, arguing that surrender would mean death anyway. Others pointed out that resistance was suicide, and that perhaps submission might save the civilian population. Rukn al-Din himself was paralyzed by indecision. He was not a military commander. He was a religious leader thrust into an impossible situation with no good options. In the end, pragmatism won. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion. On November 19, 1256, Rukn al-Din sent word to Hulagu that he was prepared to negotiate surrender, not of Alamut alone, but of the entire Nizari state. Hulagu's response was calculated to extract maximum humiliation. He agreed to receive Rukn al-Din's submission, but on his terms. The young imam would come to the Mongol camp in person. He would order every Nizari fortress to surrender immediately. He would accompany the Mongol army as they dismantled his state piece by piece. Only then, perhaps, would his life be spared. Rukn al-Din descended from Alamut in late November 1256. It must have been a surreal journey, leaving the fortress that had never fallen, walking through Mongol lines where warriors watched him with the casual indifference of men who had seen 1,000 defeated kings. He was brought before Hulagu not as a negotiating partner, but as a supplicant. The Khan sat in judgment, surrounded by his generals, and dictated terms. The orders were simple. Send word to every Nizari fortress. Open your gates. Dismantle your walls. Surrender your weapons. Any fortress that resisted would be destroyed, its population killed without exception. Rukn al-Din obeyed. Letters were sent out bearing his seal, commanding submission. One by one, the fortresses complied. Lamsar, which had held out against the Seljuks for decades, opened its gates. Gerdika, perched on an even higher peak than Alamut, began negotiations. The network that had taken a century and a half to build dissolved in weeks. But Alamut itself had not yet fallen. The garrison there, now under the command of officers who no longer took orders from Rukn al-Din, refused to surrender. They argued that their imam was under duress, that his commands were invalid, that resistance was their sacred duty. Hulagu's patience, never abundant, evaporated. In early December 1256, the Mongol army moved into position around Alamut. The siege engines that had shattered Maymun-Diz were hauled up mountain paths, dragged by teams of oxen and forced laborers. Engineers surveyed the fortress from every possible angle. The approach was narrow, yes. The cliffs were sheer, but the walls themselves were stone, and stone could be broken. The bombardment of Alamut began on December 8, 1256. The first stones struck the outer fortifications with precision born of experience. Dust clouds rose into the winter air. Defenders scrambled to repair damage, but the rate of incoming fire was relentless. A trebuchet could launch a projectile every few minutes. With multiple machines operating in coordinated salvos, there was no respite. On December 15, after 1 week of continuous bombardment, the main tower of Alamut cracked. Not collapsed, not yet, but visibly weakened, its upper sections leaning at an angle that promised imminent failure. The garrison commander, seeing the inevitable, requested terms. There were none. Hulagu ordered the fortress evacuated immediately. The Mongol troops entered Alamut on December 15, 1256. They moved through the narrow passages and chambers systematically, stripping the fortress of everything valuable. Gold and silver were loaded onto wagons. Weapons were collected for redistribution. Food stores that could have sustained the fortress for years were distributed among Mongol soldiers or burned. And then they came to the library. Alamut's library was legendary. Hassan-i Sabbah had been a scholar as much as a strategist, and he had collected books from across the Islamic world. Rare manuscripts of philosophy, astronomical texts, mathematical treatises, works that existed nowhere else. The Mongol commander, Balagai, surveying the collection, consulted with the Persian scholar named Atta Malik Uvani, who was traveling with the army as a bureaucrat and historian. Uvani saved what he could. He selected manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, arguing they had value. The rest, thousands of volumes including irreplaceable texts of Ismaili theology and philosophy, were burned. The smoke from that fire rose above Alamut for days, visible from valleys miles away. It was the incineration of memory, the deliberate erasure of a people's intellectual heritage. Rukn al-Din, meanwhile, remained in Mongol custody. Hulagu kept him alive, using him as a tool to secure the surrender of remaining fortresses. The young imam was paraded from stronghold to stronghold, ordering submission, watching as his inheritance was dismantled. In some accounts, he wept, and others, he remained stoic. The truth is lost to history, but the humiliation was absolute. By early 1257, most Nizari fortresses had fallen. Gerdikra alone continued to resist, its commander refusing to acknowledge any surrender. The Mongols laid siege, but, occupied with other campaigns, left a containment force and moved on. Gergo would hold out for another 13 years, finally surrendering in 1270, but by then it was an isolated holdout, a symbol of defiance without strategic meaning. As for Rukn al-Din, Hulagu decided his usefulness had expired. The accounts of his death vary. Some sources claim he was sent to Mongolia to meet the Great Khan, but was killed en route by Mongol guards. Others say he was executed in Persia. The most detailed account, from Uvani, suggests he was taken into the mountains and murdered quietly. His body left for scavengers. His family, including his children, were hunted down and killed. The bloodline that had led the Nizaris for generations was extinguished. The Mongols did not stop at the fortresses. They turned on the civilian population with systematic brutality. Villages in the Rudbar Valley were burned. Populations were massacred or enslaved. Estimates suggest tens of thousands died, perhaps more than 100,000 when counting the broader campaign across Persia. The Mongols intended to ensure that the Nizari state could never reconstitute itself. This was not conquest, it was annihilation. Alamut fell on December 15, 1256. By any conventional measure, the Nizari Ismaili state ceased to exist. Their fortresses were rubble. Their leaders were dead. Their population was scattered or killed. The sophisticated network of power that had challenged sultans and caliphs for a century and a half was erased in less than 2 years. But the story does not end there. What the Mongols destroyed was the political and military structure of the Nizaris, not the community itself. Survivors went underground, practicing taqiyya, the concealment of their faith. They blended into the broader Muslim population, outwardly conforming while preserving their beliefs in secret. For decades, Nizari Ismailism existed only in whispers, in hidden gatherings, in knowledge passed from parent to child in the quiet of night. In the 15th century, the community began to re-emerge. The imams, whose lineage had survived in hiding, established a new center at Anjudan in central Persia. This was not a fortress, but a village, not a military power, but a religious community. The Nizaris transformed from a covert political force into a peaceful religious sect focused on scholarship, trade, and spiritual development. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Nizari communities migrated to South Asia, establishing themselves in Gujarat, Sindh, and other regions. They became merchants, administrators, professionals. In 1817, the Qajar Shah of Persia granted the Nizari Imam the title Aga Khan, recognizing his leadership over the community. The title has passed down through generations. Today, Nizari is Mali's number between 12 and 15 million people worldwide. They live in more than 25 countries. They are known not for assassination, but for philanthropy, for education, for community development. The Aga Khan Development Network operates schools, hospitals, universities, and infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The community that once ruled through fear now contributes through service. The fall of Alamut represents one of history's clearest examples of strategic obsolescence. The Nizaris had perfected a form of asymmetric warfare that dominated the fragmented political landscape of the 12th and 13th centuries. But when that landscape changed, when a power emerged that did not play by the old rules, their entire strategy collapsed. Height did not protect them. Fortifications did not save them. The art of assassination meant nothing against an enemy willing to kill entire populations. Yet the Mongols, for all their overwhelming force, did not achieve total victory. They destroyed a state, but not a people. They burned a library, but could not erase a faith. In the end, it was the Nizaris who outlasted the Mongol Empire. Hulagu's dynasty, the Ilkhanate, collapsed within a century. The Nizari community endures to this day. The ruins of Alamut still stand in the Elburz Mountains, accessible now by roads that wind through valleys where once only goats dared tread. The walls are fragments. The towers are stumps, but the mountain itself remains, indifferent to the violence that unfolded on its peak 7.5 centuries ago. History remembers Alamut not for how it fell, but for what it represented. The audacious idea that intelligence could triumph over strength, that a small group with conviction could challenge empires, and that even in annihilation, a people might find a way to survive.